The silence of a storage room has a specific quality to it. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a library or the restful hush of a bedroom. It is a heavy, suffocating silence made of concrete dust, damp cardboard, and the lingering scent of gasoline from the lawnmower parked just a few feet away on the other side of the drywall. I was sitting on the edge of a narrow twin mattress, the kind they sell for college dorms, staring at the flickering light of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. My name is Barbara, and at 68 years old, I had become an invisible ghost in a house I had essentially bought with my own blood. Before you judge this mother, wait until you hear what her own son did to her for money. And when you find out where she was forced to sleep, you'll understand why this story changed thousands of lives forever. Stay till the end, because Barbara's final move destroyed everything they built on her betrayal. I leaned forward, my joints protesting with a sharp, familiar ache, and reached for the small Alexa speaker I had placed on a stack of plastic bins. This was my only window into the world above. Javier had set it up so I could call for help if I fell. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. He had left the drop-in feature active on the kitchen unit. The speaker crackled with static for a second, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, and then the audio from the kitchen upstairs flooded my cold little room. I heard the clink of expensive crystal, my crystal, the set I'd bought in Prague 30 years ago, and the aggressive scrape of a chair across the hardwood. "I'm telling you, Javier, it's a waste of resources," Sophie's voice hissed through the speaker. It was a voice I had once thought was charmingly energetic, but now it sounded like a serrated blade. "The heating bill for that basement is astronomical because of the poor insulation. We are literally burning money to keep a storage room at 70 degrees, so your mother can sit there and pout." "She's not pouting, Sophie," Javier replied, though his voice lacked any real steel. It was the voice of a man who had already surrendered. "She's just adjusting. It's a big change from the Berwyn house." "The Berwyn house was a drafty relic, and you know it," Sophie snapped. I could almost see her rolling her eyes, tossing her perfectly highlighted hair. "We did her a favor by taking that burden off her hands, but this temporary arrangement needs to become a permanent reality. I need that downstairs space for my overflow inventory. The Sophie's Collective spring line is arriving next week, and I cannot have boxes of yoga mats piled in the hallway while she's down there taking up space with her old photo albums and that moth-eaten recliner." I sat perfectly still, my hand hovering over the speaker. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the draft coming from under the garage door. 6 months ago, I had been the owner of a 3-bedroom home with a garden that smelled of lavender and mint. I had a life. I had dignity. I remembered the afternoon Javier came to me, his eyes wet with tears that I now realized were likely rehearsed. He had sat at my kitchen table in Berwyn, clutching my hands as if he were the one drowning. "Mom, the market is perfect right now. If you sell this place, you can move in with us. We found an estate in Barrington. It has a separate wing. You'll have your own entrance, your own kitchen, a view of the woods. You won't ever have to worry about a roof leak or a property tax bill again. We'll take care of everything. You've done enough for me. Let me do this for you." I had looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had worked double shifts at the pharmacy to put through college after his father died. and I saw a savior. I didn't see a salesman. I sold my home in 3 days. I walked away with $380,000 in equity. I handed Javier $300,000 of it the very next morning to cover the down payment on the Barrington estate. I kept $80,000 for my walking around money, thinking I was the luckiest grandmother in Illinois. But the day the moving truck arrived at the new house, the separate wing suddenly had a mold issue. "Just for a few days, Mom," Javier had said, pointing toward the stairs leading down past the kitchen. "The storage room is clean, it's dry, and it's right next to the bathroom in the mudroom. As soon as the contractors finish the remediation upstairs, we'll get you moved into your suite." That was 182 days ago. I looked around my suite. It was 10 feet by 12 feet. To my left was a stack of Sophie's Collective shipping boxes piled nearly to the ceiling. To my right was the heavy metal door that led to the garage, which rattled every time the wind picked up. My husband's mahogany desk, the one he had used to write me love letters when he was stationed overseas, was buried under a blue tarp in the corner, used as a shelf for Sophie's extra ring lights and tripod stands. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even a tenant. I was a liability they had tucked away in a corner, waiting for the shadows to finally swallow me whole. I reached under the mattress, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough concrete of the floor, and pulled out a small, dented metal box. It was a lockbox I'd had since the 70s. Inside, tucked under a photo of Javier as a toddler, was a single sheet of paper. It was the promissory note, the legal document Javier had signed in a hurry at the closing table, thinking it was just a formality to satisfy my old-fashioned lawyer. He thought I had lost it. He thought I had accidentally thrown it away during the move. He had even asked me about it 3 months ago, his voice casual, almost bored. "Hey, Mom, did you ever find that old folder from the Berwyn closing? I should probably put it in the fireproof safe for you." I had told him I couldn't find it. I had watched the relief wash over his face, a tiny, flickering smile that told me everything I needed to know. I looked at the note now. The ink was dark and permanent. It stated in no uncertain terms that the $300,000 was a loan secured by the property, and that in the event of a default or a breach of the right to occupy agreement, the full amount was due immediately. Upstairs, the Alexa speaker picked up the sound of a wine cork popping. "To the new season," Sophie said, her voice clinking with a glass. "And to finally getting this house to ourselves. We'll talk to the social worker on Monday, Javier. We'll tell her the stairs are becoming a safety hazard for her. Once she's in the facility, we can finally knock down that storage wall and expand the garage for the SUV." If this moment just made your blood boil, wait until you discover the secret Barbara was hiding under her mattress. And if you believe no parent deserves this kind of betrayal, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because Barbara's next move changes everything. I didn't turn off the speaker. I let their voices fill the room, a soundtrack to the end of my life as a victim. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and betrayal, and I began to plan. They thought I was a fragile old woman who had forgotten how to fight. They forgot that I was the one who taught Javier how to walk, and I was about to teach him exactly how it felt to fall. The following morning, the sun didn't reach my room. It never did. The only way I knew the world was waking up was by the rhythmic, heavy thud of Javier's boots on the floorboards directly above my head. It was 6:30 a.m. For 30 years I had made his breakfast, eggs over easy, toast burnt just a little on the edges, the way he liked it. Now the only thing I made was a decision to stay quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the sounds of their morning ritual to fade. I heard the high-pitched chirp of the alarm system being disarmed, the roar of the SUV's engine through the garage wall, and finally the heavy click of the kitchen door closing. Sophie would be alone now, or perhaps she'd be in her studio, the room that was supposed to be mine, filming her morning Get Ready With Me videos. I stood up, my knees clicking like dry twigs, and smoothed out my housecoat. I needed water. The small sink in the mudroom bathroom was prone to backing up, so I made my way up the 3 stairs into the kitchen. The kitchen was a masterpiece of white marble and gold hardware, all paid for with the equity from my little brick house in Berwyn. Sophie was standing by the espresso machine, her back to me. She was wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She didn't turn around, but she knew I was there. The air always seemed to thicken when I entered a room, as if my presence were a physical obstruction she had to navigate. "There's cold coffee in the pot, Barbara," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the bubbly cadence she used for her followers. "I don't want the steam from the espresso machine to ruin the humidity for my hair prep. I have a big shoot today." "I just came for some water, Sophie," I said softly, reaching for a glass. "Use the filtered tap in the mudroom from now on," she countered, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were sharp, scanning me for any sign of defiance. "I noticed some scratches on the hardwood near the island. I think it's from those orthopedic shoes of yours. We can't have the house looking lived in when the brand reps come by next week." I looked down at my shoes, soft-soled, quiet things. "I'll be careful." "Being careful isn't enough anymore," she said, leaning against the counter. "Javier and I were looking at the utility statements last night. Did you know the basement heater ran for 6 hours straight yesterday? We're trying to run a business here, Barbara. We can't be subsidizing a tropical climate in a storage room." "It was 40 degrees yesterday, Sophie. The garage isn't insulated." "Layer up then," she snapped. "That's what blankets are for. And while we're on the subject of expenses, I've decided we're going to need you to start handling your own grocery shopping. The family budget is stretched thin with Emma's new equestrian lessons. I'll clear out a small corner in the pantry for your cans, but keep it neat. I don't want to see any generic labels clashing with the aesthetic when I'm filming my kitchen tours." I didn't argue. I didn't point out that the family budget was currently fueling a lifestyle that was a lie. I simply filled my glass, took a slow sip, and looked past her into the hallway. On the wall hung a large framed photograph of the 3 of them, Javier, Sophie, and Emma, smiling in front of a sunset. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't in any of the pictures in the main house. It was as if they were trying to scrub the very memory of my existence from the walls before I was even gone. "Is there something else?" Sophie asked, her foot beginning to tap impatiently on the tile. "No," I said, "nothing else." I retreated back down the stairs, but I didn't go back to my bed. I went to the stack of boxes in the corner. I began to look for my old cell phone, the one Javier told me was broken and replaced with a modern one he monitored. He'd told me he recycled the old one, But I knew my son. He never threw anything away, he just hid it. I found it tucked inside a box of old recipes, buried under a pile of my late husband's wool socks. I plugged it into the shaky outlet behind the boxes. The screen flickered, a faint blue glow illuminating the dark corners of the room. It had 4% battery. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold concrete, and waited for it to breathe. While it charged, I pulled out my black ledger. I started a new page. May 12th. Sophie demanded I stop using the kitchen water, threatened to cut the heat, claimed my shoes were scratching the floor, grocery privileges revoked. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a witness. I was a private investigator in my own life. Upstairs, I heard the muffled sound of Sophie's intro music. "Hey, collective, welcome back to my morning routine. Today we're talking about boundaries and protecting your energy." I looked at the old phone. 8%. I opened the contacts. I scrolled past Javier Work and Javier Cell. I scrolled past Sophie. I stopped at a name I hadn't called in 3 years, Arthur P., legal. Arthur had been my husband's best friend. He was a retired attorney who spent his days fishing in Wisconsin, but he was the one who had written the promissory note. He was the one who had warned me 3 years ago when I first mentioned the idea of moving in with Javier. "Barbara," he had said over a glass of iced tea, "love is a blindfold. When you hand someone the keys to your life, make sure they aren't planning to lock you out of it. Sign the note. Keep the original. If the day ever comes where the air gets thin, call me." The air was very thin now. I looked at the door leading to the kitchen. I could hear Sophie's high-pitched laughter. She was winning. She had the house, she had the money, and she had the man I had raised. She thought she had the power. I looked back at the phone. 12%. I didn't call him yet. I needed more. I needed to prove that the suite didn't exist. I needed to prove the mold remediation was a fiction. I needed to document the cold. I reached into a box and pulled out a small digital thermometer I'd kept from my baking. I set it on the floor next to the garage door. It read 52 degrees. I took a photo of it with the old phone. Then I took a photo of the Sophie's Collective boxes blocking my only exit to the garage. I was building a cage for them, bar by bar, out of the very materials they were using to trap me. I heard a car pull into the driveway. Javier was back early. Probably forgot his laptop or some documents. I quickly hid the old phone under the mattress and sat back on my chair, picking up an old book I'd already read 5 times. The door at the top of the stairs opened. Javier's silhouette blocked the light. "Mom, you down here?" "Where else would I be, Javier?" He came down the stairs, looking around the room with a faint grimace. "Sophie said you were up in the kitchen causing a fuss about the water. Look, I know it's cramped, but you have to work with us, not against us. We're doing our best." "Are you, Javier? Are you really doing your best?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just looked at his shoes, the expensive leather ones I'd helped him pick out for his promotion. "The contractor called," he lied, his voice barely a whisper. "The mold is deeper than they thought. It's going to be another month, maybe 2. Just hang in there, okay?" "I'm hanging, Javier," I said, turning the page of my book. "I'm hanging by a thread." He turned and walked away, leaving the door open just a crack. Through that crack, I saw him go to the pantry and pull out a bottle of wine. He didn't look back. He didn't see me pick up the ledger. He didn't see me write, May 12th, Javier lied again. 2 more months. The thread is getting thinner. The days began to blur into a singular gray existence. The only way I could distinguish a Tuesday from a Saturday was by the intensity of the noise upstairs. On weekends, the house thrummed with the sound of friends, other influences and business associates of Sophie's, who arrived in gleaming European cars to drink Aperol spritzes on the patio I had funded. From my vantage point near the garage door, I could see the shadows of their legs passing by the small, high-set rectangular windows of the storage room. They were laughing, talking about real estate portfolios and tax havens, while I sat on a plastic bin, warming my hands over a mug of lukewarm tap water. On Monday morning, the flicker started. It wasn't a mistake. I knew it wasn't. The power in my storage room flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The hum of my small mini-fridge, the one I'd hidden behind a stack of blankets to keep my insulin and a bit of cream for my tea, fell silent. I sat in the pitch black for 10 minutes, waiting for the breaker to be flipped back on. It never was. I navigated the darkness by memory, my fingers trailing over the rough cardboard of the Sophie's collective boxes until I reached the stairs. I pushed open the kitchen door. Sophie was sitting at the marble island, her face illuminated by the glow of 3 different ring lights. She was mid-tutorial, blending a peach-colored cream into her cheekbones. She didn't look up when I entered, but she held up a finger, signaling me to be silent. And that, girls, is how you achieve that lit-from-within glow even when you're stressed, she cooed into her phone. Boundaries, self-care, and the right primer. See you in the comments. She clicked the End Live button, and her face dropped instantly into a mask of boredom. The power is out in my room, Sophie, I said. I know, she replied, picking up a makeup wipe. Javier had to load balance the circuit. My new studio equipment draws a lot of power, and we can't risk blowing the main fuse. Since you're just down there, we figured you didn't need the overhead light during the day. There's plenty of ambient light from the garage door gap, right? My insulin is in a fridge down there, Sophie. It needs to stay cold. She stopped wiping her face and looked at me, her eyes narrowing into 2 dark slits. You shouldn't even have a fridge down there. That wasn't part of the agreement. It's a fire hazard and an unapproved appliance. If you need to store medicine, you can put it in the main refrigerator. There's a small bin in the back of the bottom drawer. I don't want to have to walk up these stairs every time I need my medication, especially at night when you have the alarm set. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you became so dependent on everyone else, she snapped. The power stays off during my filming hours. That's final. And Barbara? If I find that fridge plugged in again, I'm having Javier haul it to the dump. We are not paying for your extras while we're trying to build a future. I felt the familiar heat of indignation rising in my throat, but I forced it down. I needed her to believe she had broken me. I needed her to feel completely dominant so she would get careless. I understand, I said, my voice intentionally trembling. I'll move the medicine. I walked over to the grand French door refrigerator. I opened it and felt the rush of cold, expensive air. It was packed with organic greens, bottled alkaline water, and gourmet cheeses. I moved a jar of truffle pesto to make room for my small plastic container of insulin. As I tucked it into the back corner, I saw it, a small printed brochure tucked under a magnet on the side of the fridge. Sunset Palms, Luxury Memory Care and Assisted Living. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't reach for it, but I memorized the name. Beneath the brochure was a handwritten note in Javier's messy scrawl. Tour scheduled for Friday, 2 p.m. Check incapacity paperwork with Arthur. They weren't just waiting for me to leave. They were actively building the cage. And they were using my old friend Arthur's name, or at least they were planning to. I retreated to the basement, but I didn't go back to bed. I waited until I heard Sophie's car pull out of the driveway for her daily Pilates class. The house went silent. I pulled out the old cell phone, 18% battery. I didn't call Arthur, not yet. I needed to know if he was really helping them, or if Javier was just using his name to make the plan sound legitimate. Instead, I used the phone's camera. I went back upstairs. My legs felt heavy, but the adrenaline was fueling me. I took a photo of the Sunset Palms brochure. I took a photo of the note. Then, I did something I hadn't done since I moved in. I walked toward the separate wing, the room that was supposed to be my suite. The door was locked. A sleek digital keypad had been installed. I looked at the keypad. I tried Javier's birthday. Nothing. I tried Sophie's birthday. Nothing. Then I tried 0300, 300,000. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open. The mold Javier had talked about for 6 months was nowhere to be found. The room was breathtaking. The walls had been painted a soft, serene sage green. A custom-built walk-in closet was filled with Sophie's designer handbags, each one illuminated by individual LED spotlights. The view of the woods was blocked by a massive high-definition green screen and professional photography backdrops. This wasn't a suite for a mother. It was a warehouse for a brand. I took photos of everything: the handbags, the lights, the lack of mold, the digital lock. I was breathing hard now, my chest tight. I realized that every word Javier had spoken to me for half a year had been a calculated lie. He hadn't just failed to protect me. He had actively participated in my erasure. I heard the garage door groan. Javier was home. I scrambled out of the room, clicked the door shut, and hurried back to the kitchen just as the mudroom door opened. I grabbed a cloth and began feebly wiping the counter, trying to look like a busy, harmless old woman. Javier walked in, looking tired. He saw me and stopped. "Mom, what are you doing up here? Sophie said you were staying downstairs today." "I was just looking for a rag, Javier, to clean up a spill." He looked at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of the old Javier, the boy who used to cry when he saw a bird with a broken wing. He looked at my hands, which were shaking, and he sighed. "Mom, we need to talk. Friday. I've found a place, a really great place. It's got a garden and people your age and professional staff who can help with your confusion." "I'm not confused, Javier," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "The city records say otherwise," he said, his voice turning cold, a direct echo of Sophie's tone. Sophie's been documenting the incidents. The stove left on, the water running, the Arthur talk. We're doing this for your safety. We'll talk more on Friday. Just go back downstairs for now. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him I knew about the incidents Sophie had staged. I didn't tell him I knew the Arthur talk was actually me calling out for the only person who could save me. I went back down the stairs. I sat on my mattress. I pulled the old phone out one last time. I dialed Arthur's number. "Arthur?" I whispered when he picked up. "It's Barbara. The air is gone, Arthur. I can't breathe. I need you to come to Barrington. And Arthur, bring the original ledger." "I'll be there by Thursday night, Barbara." The old voice crackled back, steady and strong as a mountain. "Don't sign a thing. I'm coming to take back what's yours." I hung up. I looked at the dark storage room. It didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a bunker, and I was finally ready for the war to begin. Wednesday arrived with a deceptive stillness. Upstairs, the house was unusually quiet. Sophie had gone to the city for a brand activation summit, and Javier was occupied with a series of back-to-back conference calls in his home office. This was my window. The air in the storage room felt static, heavy with the weight of the secrets I was keeping. I sat on my bed, the old cell phone gripped in my hand like a talisman. I had exactly 22% battery left, enough for one final coordination. I had spent the morning organizing my ledger. I didn't just record the cold and the insults anymore. I recorded the financial timeline. October 14th, sale of Berwyn House finalized. October 15th, $300,000 wire transfer to Javier's personal account. October 16th, promissory note signed and witnessed by Arthur. April 2nd, first mention of memory issues by Sophie. I was no longer just a mother. I was a bookkeeper of my own betrayal. At 11 a.m., I heard Javier's footsteps move toward the kitchen. I waited until I heard the distinct hiss of the espresso machine. I climbed the stairs quietly, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to see that brochure again. I needed to see the incapacity paperwork Javier had mentioned. The kitchen was flooded with bright midday sun, the kind of light that made everything look clean and honest, even though it was anything but. Javier was standing by the window, staring out at the expansive backyard, his phone pressed to his ear. I know," he was saying, his voice low and urgent. "The assessment is Friday at 2. Sophie has the video logs ready. We have the footage of her wandering at night, the footage of the stove. Yeah. Once the incapacity is triggered, the power of attorney becomes absolute. We can move the remaining $80,000 from her private savings to cover the first 6 months at Sunset Palms. After that, we'll sell her interest in the Berwyn equity back to the trust." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. "Arthur?" "No, Arthur doesn't know. He's retired in Wisconsin. He's not going to fly back for a competency hearing. We'll use a court-appointed guardian. It's cleaner that way." I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. He wasn't just taking my home. He was planning to drain my final $80,000, the money I had set aside for my own funeral, for the small gifts I wanted to leave Emma, for the last of my independence. He was going to leave me with nothing, sitting in a luxury facility until the money ran out and I was moved to a state ward. He turned around and saw me. His face didn't register guilt, only a flicker of annoyance. "Mom? I thought you were napping." "I was thirsty, Javier," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "The filtered water in the mudroom is tasting like iron." "It's fine, Mom. You're just imagining things," he said, stepping toward me. He reached out to pat my shoulder, but I flinched, a small, instinctive movement that I couldn't control. His hand stayed frozen in midair. "Look, about Friday. It's going to be a good day. We're going to get you some real help. You'll see. You're just tired." "I am tired, Javier," I said, looking him in the eye. "I'm tired of the dark. I'm tired of the lies. And I'm tired of being treated like a broken lamp you're waiting to throw in the trash." His expression hardened. The mask of the concerned son was beginning to crack. "You're being dramatic. Sophie's right. Your moods are all over the place. Just go back down. We have guests coming for dinner tonight, and I need the kitchen clear." I didn't argue. I went back down to the storage room, but I didn't sit in the dark. I pulled the small mini-fridge out from its hiding spot. I plugged it back in. I didn't care about the energy drain or Sophie's rules. If they wanted a war, they would get one. I took the old phone and sent a single text to Arthur. "The assessment is Friday at 2. They are trying to trigger incapacity. They don't know you're coming." The reply came back instantly. "I'm already in the city, staying at the Marriott. I've brought the Berwyn closing file and the recorded lien. Stay quiet, Barbara. Let them think they've won until the moment the door opens." I hid the phone one last time. I sat in my chair and pulled a wool blanket over my knees. The temperature on my digital thermometer had dropped to 48 degrees again. The garage door was rattling as a spring storm began to roll in over the suburbs. Upstairs, the house began to fill with the sounds of preparation. I heard Sophie return, her voice booming as she gave instructions to a catering assistant. I heard the clinking of silverware, the moving of furniture, the laughter of people who had no idea that the foundation of the house they were standing on was built on a crime. I closed my eyes and pictured the Berwyn house. I pictured the garden. I pictured my husband's face. I realized then that I wasn't fighting for the money. I wasn't even fighting for the house. I was fighting for the version of Javier that used to exist, the one who would be horrified by the man he had become. And if I had to destroy the house to save my own soul, I would do it without a second thought. The evening wore on. The muffled music from the party upstairs sounded like a distant circus. Every laugh felt like a slap. But I just sat there, counting the hours. 48 hours until Friday. I looked at the Sophie's Collective boxes. I looked at the dark, scuffed walls. I felt a strange sense of calm. The erosion was over. The gale was coming. And I was the one who was going to let it in. Thursday morning arrived with a biting chill. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum and a house that felt unnervingly tense. Upstairs, the celebration from the night before had left a hangover of clutter. Empty wine bottles clinking in the recycling bin, the smell of expensive catering lingering in the vents. I sat in my room, wrapped in 3 layers of sweaters, watching the digital thermometer. It read 46 degrees. I was no longer just waiting. I was documenting the final hours of my incapacity. At 10 a.m., Sophie's voice drifted down the stairs. It wasn't the performative, bubbly voice she used for her collective. It was the sharp, tactical tone of a general preparing for a final assault. "Javier, did you check the cameras?" she called out. "I need to make sure we have the clip of her wandering from Tuesday night. The social worker needs to see that she doesn't know where she is at 2 a.m. "I have it, Sophie," Javier's voice replied, sounding hollow. But she wasn't wandering. She was looking for a blanket because the heat was off. "It doesn't matter why she was up," Sophie snapped. "In the video, she looks confused. She looks lost. That's the narrative. If we don't get her into Sunset Palms this month, the bridge loan for the new warehouse is going to fall through. We need her equity, Javier. We need it now." I sat on my bed, my hands gripped tightly in my lap. They were talking about me as if I were a piece of equipment that needed to be traded in for a newer model. The wandering they were filming was my struggle for survival in a room they had intentionally made uninhabitable. I reached for the old phone, 14% battery. I opened the voice recorder app. I moved to the stairs, stepping lightly on the edges of the wood to avoid the creaks. I held the phone toward the gap in the door. "What about Arthur?" Javier asked, his voice closer now. He was in the kitchen, probably pouring his third cup of coffee. "If he finds out we used a court-appointed guardian to override his original note..." "Arthur is 1,000 miles away, Javier. He's a retired old man who wants to catch fish, not deal with your mother's decline. Stop being a coward. Tomorrow at 2, we sign the papers. We get the power of attorney. And then we finally get our lives back. No more basement ghost." Basement ghost. The words hit me like a physical blow. I clicked the save button on the recording. I had it. I had the admission of their financial motive. I had the proof of the narrative they were spinning. I retreated to the darkness of my room. I felt a strange, cold clarity. For months I had been mourning the loss of my son. I had been crying over the boy I raised, wondering where he went. But as I sat there in the 46-degree chill, I realized that the boy was gone. In his place was a man who had traded his conscience for a lifestyle, and a woman who saw people as nothing more than obstacles to her brand. I pulled out my black ledger and wrote, "May 14th. They recorded me in the night. They are using my shivering as proof of my madness. Sophie called me a basement ghost. Tomorrow is the end." I looked at the scuffed metal lockbox. I pulled it out and opened it one last time. I took out the promissory note. I ran my fingers over the signature. Javier's handwriting had been so bold back then, so confident. I tucked the note into the inner pocket of my heaviest coat. Then I took the old phone and sent one last text to Arthur. "I have the recordings. I have the photos of the suite. I am ready. See you at 2. The rest of the day was a slow-motion countdown. I watched Sophie through the garage windows as she loaded her SUV with Sophie's collective merchandise. She looked triumphant. She looked like a woman who had already won. Javier came down once around 4 p.m. He didn't look at me. He just walked to the back of the storage room and grabbed a box of old files. "You should get some sleep, Mom," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day. We have a lot of appointments." "I'll be ready, Javier," I said. He paused at the stairs, his hand on the railing. For a second, Just a split second, he looked like he wanted to say something. He looked like he wanted to apologize. But then, Sophie's voice called out from the kitchen, sharp and demanding, and the moment vanished. "Coming, Sophie," he shouted, and he disappeared back into the light. I lay down on my twin mattress. I didn't close my eyes. I watched the shadows of the trees outside dance against the garage door. I listened to the house settle, the wood moaning under the weight of the lies it held. Tomorrow, the basement ghost was going to walk through the front door, and she wasn't going to be alone. I spent the night in a state of hypervigilance. Every sound, the hum of the furnace, the click of the smart locks, the distant siren of a police car, felt like a signal. I wasn't scared anymore. I was a hunter. I was waiting for the prey to walk into the clearing. When the sun finally began to bleed through the garage windows on Friday morning, I stood up. I washed my face with the cold water from the mudroom sink. I put on my best dress, the navy blue one I had worn to my husband's funeral. I brushed my hair until it shone. I sat on my bed and waited for the clock to strike 2. The air on Friday morning felt different. It was crisp, thin, and carried the electric tension of a gathering storm. I sat on my twin mattress, my hands folded in my lap, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light that fought its way through the garage door gap. It was 8 a.m. I had 6 hours until the world as I knew it would either be restored or destroyed. Upstairs, the performance of care had begun. I heard the vacuum cleaner whirring across the hardwood, the clinking of porcelain, and the muffled, high-pitched influencer voice of Sophie as she gave orders to a cleaning crew she had hired to scrub away the evidence of my existence. "Make sure the mudroom is spotless," she shouted, "and spray some of that eucalyptus mist near the basement door. I don't want it smelling like old boxes when the social worker arrives." I looked at the thermometer. 44 degrees. They had turned the vents off entirely in my room overnight. It was a final, cruel push to make me look as frail and blue-lipped as possible for the assessment. I didn't turn on my mini-fridge. I didn't move. I sat in the cold, letting it sharpen my mind. At 10:30 a.m., Javier came down. He was wearing his good son outfit, a soft cashmere sweater and charcoal slacks. He looked like a man who spent his weekends volunteering at soup kitchens, not a man who was systematic in his mother's erasure. He was carrying a tray with a bowl of oatmeal and a glass of orange juice. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice rehearsed and gentle. "I brought you some breakfast. You need to eat. We have some important people coming over today to talk about your future." I looked at the oatmeal. It was thick and gray. "Is it my future we're talking about, Javier, or yours?" He paused, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. He set it down on a plastic bin. "Don't be difficult, Mom. You know you haven't been yourself lately. The wandering, the confusion. We just want you to be in a place where you're safe, where people can look after you 24/7. "I'm safe right here," I said, my voice steady and cold. "In the storage room next to the lawnmower. Isn't this what you promised me?" Javier turned away, unable to meet my eyes. "The mold remediation is taking longer than expected. You know that. Look, just eat. I'll be back at 1:30 to help you get upstairs. Try to look presentable." "I'll look exactly how I'm supposed to look, Javier," I said. He hurried back up the stairs, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade. Then I reached for the old cell phone. 9% battery. I sent a final text to Arthur. The cleaning crew is here. They are staging the house. Make sure you enter through the front, not the garage. I want them to see you coming. Arthur's reply was a single word. Locked. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of quiet, focused movement. I packed my small leather valise with my most essential things: the photo of my husband in his uniform, my black ledger, the digital thermometer, and the old cell phone. I tucked the promissory note into the breast pocket of my navy dress, right against my heart. I looked around the storage room one last time. For 6 months, this had been my universe. I had memorized every crack in the concrete, every water stain on the ceiling, every spider web in the corners. I had been a prisoner here, but the prison had given me something Javier and Sophie didn't have: the truth. At 1:15 p.m., I heard the doorbell ring. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. The social worker, I thought, or perhaps the court-appointed guardian. I heard Sophie's voice, bright and artificial, floating down from the foyer. "Welcome. Thank you so much for coming on such short notice. It's been such a difficult time for our family, but we just want what's best for Barbara. Please, come into the living room. I have tea and some documentation prepared." I stood up. My knees were stiff and my hands were icy, but my mind was a laser. I walked to the stairs and sat on the bottom step, hidden in the shadows. I listened to the muffled conversation above. "As you can see from these video logs," Sophie was saying, her voice dripping with fake tragedy, "she often forgets where she is. We found her in the kitchen at 3 a.m. just staring at the wall. We've tried to make her comfortable in our guest suite, but she insists on staying in the basement. She says the voices in the walls are quieter there. It's heartbreaking." I gripped the railing. The guest suite. The room I had been locked out of. The room she had filled with yoga mats and ring lights. "And her financial state?" a new professional voice asked. This must have been the social worker. "Completely unmanaged," Javier chimed in. "She's been hiding cash in old boxes. She revoked my power of attorney in a fit of paranoia last week. We're worried she's being targeted by scammers. That's why we need the emergency guardianship, to protect her assets from herself." "I understand," the social worker said. "And where is Ms. Harlow now?" "She's downstairs," Sophie said. "She's having a low day. Javier, why don't you go get her? Bring her up so we can begin the formal assessment." I heard Javier's footsteps approaching the basement door. I didn't wait for him to open it. I stood up, straightened my navy dress, and walked up the 3 stairs. I pushed the door open before he could touch the handle. Javier jumped back, a look of genuine shock crossing his face. I didn't look at him. I walked past him, through the mudroom, and straight into the white marble kitchen. Sophie was sitting on the sofa with a woman in a gray suit. There was a digital tablet on the coffee table, already displaying a legal form. When Sophie saw me, her mournful face shifted for a split second into a mask of pure, icy rage. "Barbara!" she cried, quickly recovering. "Oh, honey, you look so tired. Come, sit down. We were just telling Ms. Vance how much we love having you here." I didn't sit. I walked to the center of the room and looked at the social worker. "My name is Barbara Harlow," I said, my voice ringing out with a clarity that made Sophie flinch. I am 68 years old. I am a retired pharmacist. I am not confused. I am not hearing voices. And I am certainly not insisting on living in a storage room. Ms. Vance looked at me, then back at Sophie and Javier, her eyebrows rising. Ms. Harlow, your family has expressed some serious concerns about your cognitive health. My family, I said, turning to look at Javier, has expressed a serious interest in my $300,000 and the $80,000 I have in savings. And since they've already staged the house for you, Ms. Vance, perhaps we should start the assessment with a tour of my actual living quarters. I turned back to the basement door. Javier, why don't you show her? Show her the room without a window. Show her the 44-degree temperature. Show her the boxes of Sophie's collective that block the fire exit. The room went deathly silent. Sophie stood up, her face turning a blotchy, angry red. She's having an episode. Miss Vance, you see? The paranoia, the accusations. It's not paranoia if I have the receipts, Sophie, I said. And then the doorbell rang again. Not the polite, soft ring of a social worker. This was the long, insistent ring of a man who was coming to collect a debt. I'll get that, I said, walking toward the front door before Javier could move. I opened the door, and there he was, Arthur P. He was holding a battered leather briefcase and a thick manila folder. He looked at me, gave a short, sharp nod, and stepped into the foyer. "Who the hell are you?" Javier demanded, stepping forward. Arthur didn't even look at him. He looked at Ms. Vance. "My name is Arthur Pendle, counsel for Barbara Harlow," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "And I'm here to discuss a series of financial crimes, a breach of a promissory note, and a very clear case of elder exploitation. Javier, I suggest you sit down. This is going to be a very long afternoon." The foyer of the Barrington estate, usually a stage for Sophie's carefully curated aesthetic, suddenly felt like a courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus mist and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Sophie stood frozen by the velvet sofa, her hand still clutching a designer teacup that trembled against the saucer. Javier looked as though the floor had turned into quicksand. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Arthur didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the center of the living room, placed his battered briefcase on the marble coffee table, right next to Sophie's incapacity tablet, and popped the brass latches. The sound was like 2 pistol shots. "Ms. Vance," Arthur said, nodding toward the social worker. "I assume you are here to determine if my client is capable of managing her own affairs. I would like to submit some evidence into your record before any papers are signed." "Now wait just a minute." Sophie finally found her voice, though it was an octave higher than usual. "This is a private medical assessment. You can't just barge in here with—" "I can barge anywhere my client's signature is being coerced under false pretenses," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. He pulled a stack of high-resolution photographs from his folder and fanned them out across the table like a deck of cards. "Let's start with the guest suite you mentioned, Sophie." Ms. Vance leaned forward, her professional mask slipping as she looked at the photos I had taken with the old phone. She saw the ring lights, the green screen, the rows of designer handbags, and the digital keypad. "This," Arthur pointed to a photo of the keypad, "is the door to the room Barbara was promised. The code to enter it is 0300, the amount of thousands she loaned her son." And this, he slid another photo across, the one of my digital thermometer reading 44 degrees next to the lawnmower, is where she actually sleeps. "That's a lie," Javier blurted out, stepping toward the table. That thermometer is broken." We've been trying to get her to come upstairs for months, but she's obsessed with that basement. She's hoarding things down there. "Hoarding?" I spoke up, my voice cold and clear. "I'm hoarding the blankets I need to keep from freezing because you turned off the vents to save on the utility bill. I'm hoarding the insulin that stayed warm because you unplugged my fridge." I turned to Ms. Vance. "They told you I wander at night, didn't they? They showed you videos of me looking lost in the kitchen?" Ms. Vance nodded slowly, her eyes darting between me and the photos. "They did mention nocturnal confusion." I pulled the old cell phone from my pocket and hit play on the recording I had made just 24 hours earlier. Sophie's voice filled the room. "The Sophie's Collective spring line is arriving next week, and I cannot have boxes of yoga mats piled in the hallway while she's down there taking up space. We'll tell the social worker the stairs are a safety hazard. Once she's in the facility, we can finally knock down that storage wall." The recording continued, capturing Javier's weak agreement and Sophie's plan to drain my remaining $80,000. As the audio played, Javier's face went from ash gray to a sickly mottled white. Sophie didn't even try to defend herself this time. She just stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "Ms. Vance," Arthur said into the heavy silence that followed, "what you are witnessing is not a family in crisis. It is a predatory scheme. My client sold her home and handed her son $300,000 based on a written agreement of lifelong care and residency in a specific suite. Not only have they breached that contract, but they are currently attempting to use the legal system to strip her of her remaining assets and her civil liberties." Ms. Vance stood up, her expression now one of severe professional gravity. She took the photos and tucked them into her own briefcase. "Mr. and Ms. Harlow, I believe this assessment is over. I will be filing a report with Adult Protective Services immediately. I suggest you do not attempt to move Ms. Harlow or interfere with her belongings while this investigation is pending." "Wait!" Sophie cried, her eyes darting toward the front door. "You're taking her word over ours? We're the ones paying the mortgage. We're the ones who—" "You're the ones who are in default," Arthur said, pulling the original promissory note from his folder and holding it up for Javier to see. "Javier, you remember this, don't you? The note you thought was lost? The one with the right to occupy clause?" Javier reached out for it, but Arthur pulled it back. "The moment you denied her access to the promised suite and subjected her to uninhabitable conditions, you triggered the acceleration clause," Arthur continued. "The full $300,000 plus 4% compounded interest is now due in 48 hours. "We don't have it!" Javier screamed, his voice breaking. "It's in the house. The market is down. We can't just—" "Then I suggest you start looking for a realtor," Arthur said, snapping his briefcase shut. "Because as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, I am recording a formal lien against this property. And Barbara, I think it's time you went and got your things. We have a car waiting." I looked at my son. For a moment I wanted to feel pity. I wanted to see the boy I had raised. But then I looked at the marble floors, the expensive gadgets, and the collective branding that had replaced his soul, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clean relief. "The oatmeal was cold, Javier," I said, walking toward the stairs to fetch my valise. "And so was your heart. I'm going to go live in the sun now." I walked down into the dark storage room one last time. It didn't feel scary anymore. It just felt like an empty box. I grabbed my husband's photo, my husband's tea set, and my black ledger. When I walked back up, Sophie was sitting on the floor, crying, not for me, but for the brand she knew was about to explode. Javier was standing by the window, staring out at the woods he was about to lose. I walked out the front door and down the steps. Arthur was holding the door of a black sedan open for me. As I sat in the plush leather seat, I looked back at the house. It was a beautiful estate, but it was built on sand. "Where to, Barbara?" Arthur asked as he climbed in beside me. "To the bank, Arthur," I said, watching the Barrington gates disappear in the rearview mirror. "And then, I think I'd like to go buy some lavender plants for my new balcony." The black sedan pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching over the gravel driveway like bone hitting stone. I didn't look back at the grand facade of the Barrington estate. I didn't want to see the limestone pillars or the manicured hedges. In my mind, that house had already dissolved into what it actually was, a hollow monument to greed. Inside the car, the silence was thick, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the storage room. This was the quiet of a storm that had finally passed, leaving only the scent of ozone and the cold reality of the damage. Arthur sat beside me, his hands resting on his briefcase. He didn't speak for a long time, allowing me to breathe the filtered, climate-controlled air of a world where I was finally seen as a person again. "You did well, Barbara," he said eventually, his voice soft. "Most people would have folded long before the 6-month mark. You held your ground." "I didn't have much ground left to hold, Arthur," I replied, looking at my hands. They were still stained with a bit of dust from the storage room floor. "I just wanted to make sure that when I fell, I took the walls down with me." Our first stop was the bank. I walked through those glass doors with Arthur at my side, my navy dress rustling. This wasn't the frantic, panicked visit I had made weeks ago to revoke the power of attorney. This was a surgical strike. Arthur presented the court-certified documents and the formal notice of the lien. I watched as the branch manager, a man who had previously given Javier priority service, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. Within 20 minutes, the remaining $80,000 of my savings was moved into a locked trust that not even a king could touch without my fingerprint. "Is that it?" I asked Arthur as we walked back to the car. "For today, yes," Arthur said, "but for Javier and Sophie, the nightmare is just beginning. The city inspector I called, he's not just looking at your room, he's looking at the studio conversion. I suspect they didn't pull a single permit for that separate wing. In Barrington, that's not just a fine. It's a cease and desist on the entire property." While I was settling into a quiet, sun-filled hotel suite Arthur had arranged, the world above the basement was indeed coming apart. Back at the house, the Sophie's Collective brand was experiencing its first true viral moment, and it was a catastrophe. Ms. Vance had not been the only one watching. One of Sophie's friends, a rival influencer who had been at the party the night before and felt slighted by Sophie's ego, had captured a snippet of the social worker's arrival and the basement ghost comment. By 6 p.m., the hashtag Sophie stored her mother was trending. The comments were a bloodbath. She sold her mother's house and put her in a closet? Look at the luxury robe she's wearing while the grandma freezes. Cancel Sophie's collective, now. Sophie was in the kitchen, her phone vibrating so incessantly it sounded like a hornet's nest. She was trying to delete comments, but they were coming in at a rate of 500 per minute. Her sponsors, the organic tea brand, the luxury bedding company, the yoga wear line, began dropping her in real time. "Javier!" she screamed, throwing her phone at the marble island. "Do something! Call the lawyers! Call the PR firm! My life is disappearing!" Javier was sitting at the dining table, the one where they had tried to sign away my life. He was staring at the promissory note Arthur had left a copy of. He looked at the numbers, $300,000 plus interest. He looked at the foreclosure notice from the bank that had arrived in the afternoon mail, a direct result of Arthur's lien triggering a cross-default clause in their mortgage. "There is no life left to save, Sophie," Javier said, his voice flat. "The bank is calling the note. The city is red-tagging the studio. We don't have the cash to fight the lien, and we don't have the reputation to get a loan." "Then find a way," she shrieked. "Sell the cars, sell Emma's horse. I won't go back to a 2-bedroom apartment, Javier. I won't." "You don't understand," Javier said, finally looking up at her. "We aren't going back to a 2-bedroom apartment. We're going to be lucky if we aren't in a courtroom facing elder abuse charges. My mother recorded everything, Sophie. She recorded you talking about the basement ghost." The realization hit Sophie like a physical blow. She slumped onto the floor, her silk robe pooling around her, the same floor she had claimed my shoes were scratching. Meanwhile, across town, I was sitting on my hotel balcony. The air was warm, smelling of late spring rain and city lights. I had a cup of tea in a real porcelain cup. I opened my black ledger to the very last page. May 15th. The mirror is broken. They can no longer see the version of themselves they invented. I am Barbara Harlow. I am 68, and I am finally home. I picked up the old cell phone. It had 2% battery left. I watched the screen fade to black, the light disappearing for the last time. I didn't need it anymore. The evidence was in the right hands. The debt was being called. I looked at the stars and thought about the lavender I would plant tomorrow. I thought about the silence of a room with a window. And for the first time in 6 months, I slept without a blanket pulled over my head, because the cold could no longer reach me. The following weeks felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion, silent, inevitable, and utterly thorough. While I spent my mornings in a bright corner apartment in a quiet part of the city, Arthur spent his afternoons systematically dismantling the life Javier and Sophie had built on my back. The liquidation began with the collective. Because the Sophie's Collective brand was legally tied to the house as a home-based business, the city's red tagging of the studio became a legal anchor. Without the ability to film or store inventory, and with every major sponsor having scrubbed her name from their websites, the income dried up overnight. I sat with Arthur in his office as he went over the inventory list of the house's contents. "They're selling the furniture, Barbara," Arthur said, sliding a document across the desk. The marble-topped island, the gold leaf mirrors, the Italian leather sofas. It's all going to auction. Even the SUV is back at the dealership. They're trying to raise enough cash to pay off the lien before the bank moves to a full foreclosure. "And the handbags?" I asked, thinking of that hidden room. Those were the first things to go. Sophie tried to sell them to a luxury reseller, but when the news broke about the basement ghost, the reseller refused to take them. They didn't want the brand association. She ended up selling the entire collection for pennies on the dollar to a private liquidator just to cover her legal retainers. I looked out the window. "What about Emma?" "She's with Sophie's sister for the summer," Arthur said gently. "Javier and Sophie are, well, they aren't exactly in a state to parent right now. They're living in a short-term rental near the airport. It's a one-bedroom. Quite a change from the Barrington acreage." I didn't feel joy at the news. I felt a strange, detached sense of justice. It was the law of physics. What goes up based on a lie must eventually come down based on the truth. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning. Javier called me. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I walked out. I let the phone ring 4 times before I picked up. "Mom?" His voice was ragged. He sounded 20 years older. "Mom, please. We've sold everything. We've turned over the $300,000 to Arthur's escrow. We're done. Can you tell the investigators that it was all a misunderstanding? The APS report is going to prevent me from getting a job in finance again. I'll be blacklisted." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Javier," I said, my voice steady. "It was a choice. You chose the marble. You chose the collective. You chose to let me freeze because you were afraid of a utility bill. You didn't just lose your job, Javier. You lost your mother." "I'm sorry," he choked out. "Sophie, she pushed so hard and You're a grown man, Javier. Don't blame the woman you chose for the man you became." I hung up. I didn't block him, but I didn't wait for him to call back. A week later, the Barrington house was officially sold at a short sale. The separate wing that was supposed to be mine was gutted by the new owners, who planned to turn it back into a traditional family room. The boxes of Sophie's collective were hauled away by a junk removal service, ending up in a landfill alongside the thousands of dollars of spoiled influencer dreams. Arthur called me that evening. "The wire cleared, Barbara. $300,000, plus the interest, plus the legal fees. It's all back in your account. You're whole again." "No, Arthur," I said, looking at the small garden I had started on my balcony. The lavender was finally starting to bloom, its scent sweet and calming in the evening air. "I'm not whole, but for the first time in a long time, I am free." I took my black ledger and turned to the very last page. I didn't write about the money or the house. I wrote about the light. June 20th. The sun stays on the balcony until 8 p.m. The tea is hot. The door is unlocked from the inside. The story is finished. I closed the book and put it on the shelf, right next to the photo of my husband. The basement ghost was gone. There was only Barbara now. The $300,000 wire transfer sat in my bank account like a cold, heavy weight. In the quiet of my new apartment, the silence was no longer heavy with dust, but it was haunted by the echoes of what had been broken. Every time I looked at the total balance on my bank statement, I didn't see numbers. I saw the face of my son as a 6-year-old, the way he used to hold my thumb when we crossed the street. I had the money, I had the freedom, but the wound Javier had carved into my heart wasn't something a bank teller could fix. A few days after the settlement, I received a package. It was a small, battered box that had been forwarded through Arthur's office. It was one of the moth-eaten boxes Sophie had tried to throw away, the one containing my husband's letters from his time in the Navy. I sat on my new sofa, the sunlight streaming in through windows that actually opened, and I began to read. My husband, Frank, had been a man of few words, but in these letters he was a poet of the mundane. He wrote about the taste of salt on the deck, the way the stars looked over the Pacific, and most of all, his dreams for our son. "Take care of the boy, Barb," one letter from 1982 read. "He's got a soft heart. Make sure the world doesn't harden it too much. He's going to be the man who looks after you when I'm gone." I let the letter drop to my lap. A single hot tear traced a path down my cheek. Frank hadn't been wrong about the boy. He had just been wrong about the world. He hadn't seen a world where a personal brand was more important than a mother's breath. He hadn't seen a world where a silk robe was worth more than a family's soul. But as I sat there, I realized something. If I spent the rest of my life mourning the son I lost, then Javier and Sophie were still winning. They were still keeping me in a basement of my own making. I picked up the phone and called Arthur. "Arthur," I said, my voice finally losing its tremor. "The $300,000. I want to move half of it." "To where, Barbara? A higher yield bond? A diversified portfolio?" "No," I said. "I want to start a foundation. I want to call it the Open Window. I want to help other seniors who are stuck in storage rooms or hidden in back bedrooms or having their pensions drained by children who think they've already inherited the world." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Arthur's heavy breathing, and then the sound of a smile in his voice. "Barbara Harlow," he whispered, "you really are a piece of work. Frank would be damn proud." "I don't care about the pride, Arthur. I care about the light. I want to make sure no one else has to cook oatmeal on a shaky hot plate in the dark." While I was planning the open window, the collapse of Javier's world reached its final ugly stage. The criminal investigation into elder exploitation had been upgraded. Because Javier had used the power of attorney to attempt those large, unauthorized withdrawals while I was being kept in uninhabitable conditions, the district attorney was looking at felony charges. Javier called me from a payphone. He was crying, real jagged sobs this time. "Mom, they're going to indict me. Sophie left, Mom. She took what was left of the liquidated cash and she's gone to stay with some manager in Miami. She told the police I was the one who came up with the basement idea. She said she was just following my lead." I listened to the sound of the traffic in the background of his call. He was at a bus stop. The logistics legend was waiting for a Greyhound. "What do you want me to do, Javier?" I asked. Just tell them you gave me permission. Tell them it was all a game we were playing. Please, Mom. If I go to prison, I'll never see Emma again." I looked at the photo of Frank on my shelf. I looked at the lavender on my balcony. "I already told the truth, Javier," I said, "and the truth is the only thing that can set you free now, even if that freedom is behind a set of bars. You made your bed in that basement for 6 months, son. Now you have to sleep in the one the state has provided for you." I hung up. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I just felt a profound, quiet stillness. I went to my desk and opened a new ledger. This one wasn't black. It was a bright, hopeful blue. On the first page, I didn't write about debts or lies. I wrote a list of names. Names of people Arthur had found, seniors who were being quieted, hidden, and erased. The basement ghost was gone. The mother was gone. Barbara Harlow, the advocate, was just getting started. The office for the open window wasn't a grand suite in a glass skyscraper. It was a small two-room space above a bakery in the city, smelling of yeast and warm sugar, a far cry from the antiseptic eucalyptus mist of the Barrington estate. I sat behind a modest oak desk, my husband's tea set placed neatly on a side table. Arthur sat opposite me, his legal pads replaced by a stack of files that looked more like police dossiers. "This is the first one, Barbara," Arthur said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Her name is Martha, 74. Her daughter and son-in-law moved her into the den of their townhouse in Naperville. They've changed the locks on the front door, and they've stopped giving her her blood pressure medication because she gets too talkative when she's feeling well." I opened the file. The woman in the photo looked just like I had 3 months ago, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a deep, soul-crushing shame. It's the shame that keeps us quiet. You don't want the neighbors to know your own child is a monster. You don't want the world to know you failed at the one job that was supposed to be forever. "What's the financial angle?" I asked, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. "The house is in Martha's name, but the daughter used a forged signature to take out a second mortgage. They're blowing the cash on a rebranding for the husband's failing marketing firm. Sound familiar?" "Like a mirror image," I whispered. "What do we need to do?" "We don't have the luxury of a 6-month slow play here, Bob. Martha's health is actually declining. We need a wellness check that's backed by a legal representative and an EMT. And we need a place for her to go immediately." I stood up, grabbing my coat. The navy blue one with the promissory note, now framed and hanging on my wall as a reminder, once lived in. "We're using the trust," I said. "I've already secured a room at the manor house down the street from my apartment. It has windows that catch the morning sun. Tell the EMT to meet us there in 20 minutes. The drive to Naperville was a blur of gray highway and white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. As we pulled up to the suburban townhouse, the lawn was perfectly mowed, the flower beds bursting with expensive annuals. It looked like the picture of the American dream. But I knew the rot that lived behind those designer doors. The daughter, a woman in her 40s with a forced, brittle smile, opened the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes darting to the EMT's uniform and then to Arthur's suit. "We're here to see Martha," Arthur said, stepping forward with a court order we'd fast-tracked that morning. "We have reason to believe her medical needs are being neglected and her assets are being misappropriated." "That's ridiculous," the daughter shrieked, her voice rising in a way that signaled panic. "My mother is resting. She's confused. She doesn't want visitors." I stepped past her. I didn't wait for permission. I followed the scent of stale air and old fabric toward the back of the house. I found the den. It was a tiny room with a single flickering fluorescent light. Martha was sitting in a recliner that was peeling, her ankles swollen, staring at a television that wasn't even turned on. I walked over and knelt beside her, taking her cold, thin hand in mine. "Martha?" I whispered. "My name is Barbara. I'm here because I know what the dark feels like, and I'm here to tell you that it's time to come into the light." Martha looked at me, and for a second I saw the ghost of myself. "I don't want to cause trouble," she whimpered. "My daughter, she says I'm a burden." "You are not a burden," I said, my voice ringing out so loud the daughter could hear it from the hallway. "You are the owner of this house. You are a woman of dignity, and you are leaving with us. Right now." The daughter tried to block the door, but Arthur stood his ground. "Step aside, ma'am," he said, holding up his phone. "The police are 3 minutes away. If we find that medication in the trash or a forged signature on that mortgage, your next rebrand is going to be in a prison jumpsuit." We walked Martha out of that house as the neighbors watched from behind their curtains. I saw the look on the daughter's face, the same mixture of entitlement and terror I'd seen on Sophie. It was the look of a predator who realized the prey had found a pack. As the EMTs helped Martha into the transport van, I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the townhouse. It was just a building. It had no power over her anymore. "One down, Arthur," I said. "One down," he agreed. When we got back to the city, I didn't go home. I went to the manor house. I watched as Martha was settled into a room with a view of the park. I watched the color slowly return to her face as she realized she didn't have to ask permission to breathe. I sat with her as the sun began to set. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice finally steady. I looked at the scars on my own heart, the memories of the storage room, and the echoes of Javier's lies. "Because for a long time I was a ghost," I said, "and I've decided that ghosts deserve to have their voices back. Sleep well, Martha. Tomorrow we start the paperwork to get your house back." I walked home under the city lights. My legs didn't ache. My chest didn't feel tight. I realized that the open window wasn't just a foundation, it was a bridge, and I was going to make sure that as long as I had breath in my lungs, no one would ever have to cross it alone. It started with a single post. I sat at my desk in the small office above the bakery, the morning light catching the steam from my tea. Arthur was across from me, reviewing a subpoena, but I wasn't looking at legal documents. I was looking at the old cell phone, the one that had captured the sounds of my basement life. I realized that while Arthur was fighting in the courtrooms, I needed to fight in the court of public opinion. I didn't want fame. I wanted a warning. I created a page for the open window. I didn't use a professional logo or a filtered headshot. I uploaded a single grainy photo, the 44-degree reading on the digital thermometer sitting next to a stack of Sophie's collective yoga mats. Underneath it I wrote, "My name is Barbara. I was a mother, a pharmacist, and a homeowner. My son and daughter-in-law told the world I was confused, so they could lock me in a storage room and spend my life savings on a marble kitchen. I am not a ghost anymore, and I am coming for every closet you've hidden your parents in." I hit post. Within 2 hours, the notification bell on my computer began to ring with the persistence of a fire alarm. By noon, the post had been shared 10,000 times. By evening, it was 100,000. The collective had lived by the algorithm, and now they were being slaughtered by it. But something else was happening. The comments weren't just attacks on Sophie. They were confessions. My brother moved my dad into the garage last winter. I thought it was for his safety. Now I realize I haven't seen his bank statements in a year. My mother is in a luxury home she hates, while her house is being flipped for profit. What can I do? I looked at Arthur. We're going to need a bigger office. We're going to need a bigger state, he replied, his eyes wide as he scrolled through the influx of messages. The media arrived like a swarm. News vans parked outside the bakery, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. They wanted the basement grandma. They wanted the influencer scandal. But I refused to give them the melodrama they craved. When I finally sat down for a televised interview with a major network, I wore my navy dress. I didn't cry. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like an auditor. "Ms. Harlow," the interviewer asked, leaning in with practiced empathy, "how does it feel to see your son facing criminal charges after you went viral?" "It feels like the truth is finally catching up to the lies," I said, my voice steady. "But this isn't about my son anymore. This is about a culture that treats the elderly like depreciating assets. We aren't old cars you can park in a dark garage until the parts are worth more than the vehicle. We are the architects of the world you're standing in, and we are still here." I held up the old cell phone. If you are listening to this, and you are being told you are confused while your money is being moved, or if you are being kept in a room without a window while your children live in luxury, call us. The window is open. That night, the website for The Open Window crashed from the sheer volume of traffic. But it didn't matter. The signal had been sent. In a luxury hotel room in Miami, Sophie watched the broadcast. She saw her own name scrolled across the bottom of the screen in relation to criminal investigation, elder exploitation. She saw the collective hashtag being replaced by hashtag the open window. She realized that the brand she had built on a foundation of silence was being dismantled by a woman she had thought was too old to speak. In the county jail, Javier sat on a steel bench, watching the same broadcast on a grainy overhead monitor. He saw his mother, the woman he had called a parasite, standing in the center of a national movement. He saw the strength in my eyes, a strength he had tried to extinguish with cold air and dark walls. He lowered his head into his hands. For the first time, he wasn't crying because he was caught. He was crying because he finally realized that the storage room hadn't been my prison. It had been his. I walked home that night through a city that felt different. People looked at me, not as a ghost, but as a person. A woman stopped me on the corner of 5th Street, her eyes wet with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "I called my mom tonight. I'm going to go see her tomorrow. I think I stopped listening to her. Thank you for reminding me she's still there." I went up to my apartment and sat on my balcony. The lavender was thick and fragrant. I realized that the viral expansion wasn't about the numbers. It was about the silence being broken. The world was finally listening. And I still had so much more to say. The Cook County Courthouse was a monolith of gray stone and echoing hallways, a place where the messy emotions of family life were distilled into the cold, clinical language of the law. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my back straight, wearing the same navy dress I had worn the day I left the Barrington estate. To my left sat Arthur, his face a mask of professional stoicism. When Javier was led into the courtroom, the sound of his shackles hitting the floor was a sharp, rhythmic, metallic clinking that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. He looked gaunt. The expensive cashmere sweaters were gone, replaced by a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that made him look like a child playing dress-up in a nightmare. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the defense table, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the building were resting entirely on his spine. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The trial lasted 4 days, but it felt like a lifetime. The prosecution didn't just present evidence, they built a museum of my misery. The digital thermometer photos were enlarged on a massive screen, the numbers 44 degrees Fahrenheit glowing like a neon warning sign. They played the audio recordings I had captured on the old cell phone, Sophie's voice calling me a basement ghost, echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. Each word was a nail being driven into the coffin of Javier's defense. Then, it was my turn to take the stand. As I walked toward the witness box, the silence in the room was absolute. I sat down and looked at my son. For the first time in months, he met my gaze. His eyes were swimming with a mixture of terror and a desperate, pathetic hope that I would save him one last time. "Ms. Harlow," the prosecutor began, "did your son ever explain why the heating was turned off in your living quarters?" "He said it was an energy drain," I replied, my voice steady, carrying to the back of the room. "He said that Sophie's brand required the power more than I did. He told me to layer up." "And did he ever mention the $300,000 you provided for the home?" "He told his wife I had lost the paperwork. He told me I was confused when I asked about it. He used my love for him as a weapon to make me doubt my own sanity." The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He was a sharp man in a $1,000 suit, hired with the last of the liquidated funds. "Ms. Harlow, isn't it true that you were experiencing some memory lapses? Isn't it true that your son was merely overwhelmed by the burden of your care?" "The only thing Javier was overwhelmed by," I said, leaning forward, "was the cost of the marble in his kitchen. He didn't have a burden of care because he didn't provide any. He provided a storage room and a hot plate. You don't put a burden in a cellar, you put trash there." The jury reached a verdict in less than 3 hours. Guilty. Felony elder abuse, financial exploitation, and criminal neglect. As the judge read the sentence, 5 years in a state correctional facility, Javier finally broke. He began to sob, the sound jagged and ugly. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. I'll give it back. I'll give it all back." I stood up and walked out of the courtroom before the bailiffs could lead him away. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. I had won the case, but I had lost my son a long time ago. Arthur caught up to me on the courthouse steps. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright. "It's over, Barb," he said, putting a hand on my arm. "The judge is also ordering a full restitution of the $80,000 he tried to siphon. He's going away for a long time." "He was already gone, Arthur," I said, looking out at the city. He's been gone since the day he decided that a house was more important than the woman who gave him life. As I walked toward the car, a group of reporters tried to shove microphones in my face. "Ms. Harlow, any words for your son? Is Sophie next?" I stopped and looked into the nearest camera lens. "My son is a consequence," I said. "But the system that allowed him to think he could hide me in the dark is the real criminal." Today wasn't about revenge. It was about the fact that you can't build a mansion on a foundation of broken people. The lights are back on now. I drove away, leaving the courthouse behind. In my mind, I was already moving on to the next phase. Javier was in a cell, but there were still thousands of basement ghosts waiting for someone to open the door. While Javier sat in a concrete cell, the shadow of the woman who had architected our downfall remained at large. Sophie had fled to Florida, attempting to outrun the cellar scandal by reinventing herself under a different name. But the digital world she had used to humiliate me was now the very thing hunting her. Arthur and I sat in the office above the bakery. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon rolls, but the atmosphere inside was clinical. "She's surfacing again, Barbara," Arthur said, turning his laptop screen toward me. On the screen was a new social media profile, Sloane's Sanctuary. It was a carbon copy of the old Collective, the same muted tones, the same talk of protecting your peace, the same luxury aesthetic. But instead of yoga mats, she was now selling legacy coaching for young professionals. "She thinks 3 states and a name change are enough to wipe the slate clean," Arthur continued. "But the Florida state attorney has been watching the Illinois trial. They've opened a secondary investigation into the management fees she charged your estate." "I don't want her in a cell next to Javier, Arthur," I said, staring at her smiling profile picture. "I want her to lose the only thing she ever actually cared about. I want her to lose the audience." I spent the next 48 hours working with a group of young digital investigators, volunteers for the open window, who were as skilled with code as I was with a ledger. We didn't send a letter to the police. We sent a signal to the sponsors. We compiled a transparency report. It included the audio of her calling me a ghost, the photos of the storage room, and a side-by-side comparison of her Sloane persona and the Sophie who had unplugged a medical fridge. On Thursday morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went live on my own platform. I didn't have a ring light. I didn't have a makeup artist. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, the morning sun hitting my face. "Good morning," I said to the thousands of people watching the little red icon on my screen. "Many of you have asked about the woman who helped build the basement I lived in. She's in Miami now. She calls herself Sloane. She's telling you how to live your best life, how to curate your space, and how to protect your energy." I took a slow sip of tea. "But I want to tell you about the energy she protected. She protected the energy of a house she didn't pay for by turning off the heat for a 68-year-old woman. She curated a space for her handbags while I slept on a twin mattress next to a lawnmower. If you are following her for legacy coaching, ask her about the legacy she left in Barrington." The reaction was instantaneous. Within an hour, Sloane's sanctuary was flooded. Every time she posted a photo of a sunset or a green juice, the comments were filled with the same 3 words: "Where is Barbara?" By Friday afternoon, her new sponsors pulled out. Her PayPal account was frozen pending the investigation, but the final blow came when the Florida authorities arrived at her luxury rental to serve a deposition. Sophie didn't go quietly. She filmed the encounter, trying to play the victim, crying to her remaining followers that she was being bullied by a bitter old woman. But for the first time, the camera smile failed. The world saw the jagged, ugly panic of a woman who had run out of people to exploit. Arthur walked into the office late that evening, holding a printout of a news alert. "She's broke, Bob. The civil suit we filed for the return of the $300,000 has resulted in a freeze on all her assets. She's moved out of the Miami condo. Last anyone saw, she was checking into a budget motel with 3 suitcases of clothes she can't sell." I looked at the black ledger one last time. I drew a single thick line through Sophie's name. "She's not a shadow anymore, Arthur," I said. "She's just a woman in a small room. I hope the walls are thin. I hope she can hear every sound of the world moving on without her." I went home and stood on my balcony. The city was loud, vibrant, and real. I realized that Sophie's greatest crime wasn't the cold or the storage room. It was the attempt to turn my life into a commodity. But she had failed. I wasn't a brand. I wasn't a collective. I was Barbara. And for the first time, I felt like the air around me was finally, truly mine. The momentum of the trial and the exposure of Sophie's new identity created a tidal wave of support that I never anticipated. What started as a 2-room office above a bakery was now a nationwide movement. We weren't just a foundation anymore. We were a network of modern sentinels, and I was the reluctant figurehead. Arthur and I sat in our new headquarters, a renovated brownstone that had once been a neighborhood library. The walls were still lined with books, but the tables were now covered in laptops, high-speed scanners, and a phone system that never stopped blinking. "We have chapters in 32 states now, Barbara," Arthur said, tapping the glass of his tablet. "Volunteer lawyers, social workers, and even retired accountants who are specialized in forensic auditing. We're calling it the Financial First Responders Unit." The logic was simple, yet brutal. Financial abuse is the silent precursor to physical neglect. If we could catch the moment a child starts managing a parent's bank account without transparency, we could prevent the basement before it ever happened. We were looking for the red flags I had missed, the sudden name changes on titles, the temporary moves into spare rooms, the isolation from old friends. I spent my days traveling to these new chapters. I didn't give inspirational speeches, I gave tactical briefings. I taught seniors how to use the same technology that had been used to silence them. I showed them how to record conversations, how to check their own credit scores, and how to spot the language of erasure. Phrases like, "You're getting confused, Mom," or "Let me handle the passwords for you, it's just easier." One afternoon in Seattle, a man approached me after a seminar. He was in his 80s, impeccably dressed in a suit that had seen better days, but with hands that shook slightly as he clutched a manila folder. "My daughter wants to sell my cottage," he whispered, looking around the crowded community center as if she might be lurking in the shadows. "She says the stairs are too much for me. She's already picked out a luxury room for me in her basement. She says it'll be like a private apartment. She even showed me photos of a new rug she bought for it." I took his hand. His skin felt like parchment, cold and dry. I looked him in the eye with the intensity of someone who had survived the dark and knew the temperature of betrayal. "Is there a window, Harold?" I asked. "No," he said, his voice cracking like a dry branch. "It's under the porch. She said I wouldn't mind because I mostly watch TV anyway." "Then you aren't going," I said, my voice ringing with a finality that made a few people nearby turn to look. "Tonight we're going to move your cottage into a trust, and tomorrow you're going to tell her that those stairs are exactly the exercise you need to stay out of her basement." As I watched him walk away with one of our volunteer lawyers, I realized that the network was doing more than just saving people. It was restoring the natural order of things. We were taking the basement ghosts and giving them back their seats at the head of the table. We were making it socially expensive to be a predator. But as the network grew, so did the complexity of my own heart. The more I helped others, the more I was forced to face the one person I had been avoiding, my granddaughter, Emma. She was the innocent bystander in the war between me and her parents. She had been told I was sick. She had been told I didn't want to see her because I was angry. And now she was old enough to read the news, to see her father's mugshot on the local bulletins, and to see her mother's Sloane persona shredded by the internet. I sat in my office that evening, the smell of the bakery downstairs drifting up through the floorboards. I was looking at a letter that had arrived from her summer camp. It wasn't a lawyer's demand or a son's desperate plea for a character witness. It was a pink envelope with a sticker of a sunflower on the back, addressed to Grandma Barb in a loopy, uncertain hand. I realized that building a national network was easy compared to the task of repairing a broken family. The open window was wide open for the world, but I had to decide if I was brave enough to let the light back into the part of my life that still smelled like the storage room. I picked up a pen. My hand didn't shake. The pink envelope sat on my desk for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. I was a woman who had faced down a corrupt legal system, a predatory daughter-in-law, and the freezing dark of a basement. Yet a 10-year-old's handwriting made my pulse skip. When I finally broke the seal, a small hand-drawn picture fell out. It was a drawing of a house, not the Barrington estate with its cold limestone, but a simple yellow house with a large tree and a porch. In the window there was a stick figure with white hair. The letter read, "Dear Grandma Barb, Mom says you're busy being a hero on TV. Dad isn't home right now, and Aunt Sarah says he's going to be away for a long time. I found your videos on the tablet. I saw the room you stayed in. I'm sorry I didn't come down to say hi more. They told me you were sleeping or that you were having quiet time. I didn't know it was cold. I miss our tea parties. Do you still have the teapot with the blue flowers? Aunt Sarah says I can come see you if you want. Do you want to see me? Love, Emma." I leaned back in my chair, the paper fluttering in my hand. The guilt was a physical weight, sharper than the cold had ever been. I had been so focused on the war with Javier and Sophie that I had almost forgotten the collateral damage. Emma had lived in that house while I was suffering beneath her feet. She had been lied to, manipulated, and eventually abandoned by her mother. I picked up the phone and called Sarah, Javier's sister. We hadn't spoken since the trial. She had been the one to take Emma in when the collective collapsed. "She needs you, Barbara," Sarah said, her voice weary. She's confused. She sees her mother on those gossip sites and her father in the news, and she doesn't understand why the world is so angry at them. But she remembers the tea parties. That's the only part of her life that feels real right now. "Bring her on Saturday," I said. "And Sarah, bring her to the park near my apartment. I don't want her first memory of me in months to be in an office." Saturday was a bright, breezy day. I sat on a park bench, clutching a bag of lemon drops, Emma's favorite. When I saw her running across the grass, her pigtails bouncing, I felt a part of my heart that had been frozen since the storage room finally began to thaw. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around my neck, and for a long time we just sat there. I smelled the scent of grass and sunshine on her hair, a sharp contrast to the smell of dust and damp concrete I had lived with for so long. "Are you okay, Grandma?" she whispered, pulling back to look at me. "Is the new house warm?" "It's very warm, Emma," I said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "It has the biggest windows you've ever seen. And yes, I still have the teapot with the blue flowers. It's waiting for you." We spent the afternoon talking about everything except her parents. We talked about school, her drawings, and the dog she wanted to get. But eventually, the shadow of the house returned. "Is Dad a bad man?" she asked, her voice small, staring at her shoes. I took a deep breath. This was the hardest truth I'd ever had to tell. "Your dad made some very bad choices, Emma," I said gently. "He let himself get lost in things that didn't matter, like money and big houses. But people aren't just one thing. He's the man who made those choices, but he's also the man who used to read you bedtime stories. Right now, he's in a place where he has to think about those choices, and your mom, she's lost too." "I don't want to be like them," she said. "You won't be," I promised, "because you know that the most important thing in a house isn't the kitchen or the handbags. It's the people inside, and how we take care of each other." As I watched her walk back to Sarah's car, waving until she disappeared from view, I realized that my mission had shifted. The open window was about saving seniors, but it was also about breaking the cycle of greed that had nearly destroyed my family. I went home and looked at the blue ledger. I didn't write about a rescue or a legal win. I wrote a single line. June 28th. The tea was sweet. The window is open for the next generation. The $300,000 was back in my account, the legal fees were settled, and my name was cleared. But there was one final ghost I hadn't faced, the house on Maple Avenue in Berwyn, the house where I had raised Javier, the house Frank and I had bought with a 30-year mortgage and a lifetime of hope. Javier had sold it in a fire sale to a developer named Miller, who planned to flip it for a massive profit. For months, I couldn't bring myself to drive past it. I didn't want to see the "for sale" sign or the construction dumpsters filled with my old life. "It's back on the market, Barbara," Arthur told me one morning, sliding a real estate listing across my desk. Miller got caught up in a zoning dispute. He finished the interior renovations, but he needs to liquidate his assets fast to cover a different project. He's asking exactly what he paid for it. I looked at the photos. The blue shutters were gone, replaced by a modern charcoal gray. The overgrown rose bushes I had tended for decades had been ripped out for minimalist gravel beds. It looked like a stranger wearing my husband's clothes. "Buy it," I said. "Barbara, you have a beautiful apartment. Why go back to a house that holds so much pain?" "Because it doesn't just hold pain, Arthur. It holds the foundation, and I'm not going to live in it. I have a better idea." 2 weeks later, I stood on the sidewalk of Maple Avenue, holding the heavy brass key. The neighborhood smelled of fresh-cut grass and charcoal grills, the sounds of Berwyn. I walked up the porch steps, my heart doing a slow, steady thud. The interior was hollow. The developers had knocked down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room, creating that open concept Sophie loved so much. They had painted everything alabaster white. It looked like a gallery waiting for art. I walked into the master bedroom. This was where Frank had passed away. This was where we had sat on the floor and put together Javier's first crib. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I didn't see the alabaster white walls. I saw the faded floral wallpaper and the way the light used to hit the dust motes at 4 p.m. I realized then that I wasn't there to reclaim my past. I was there to repurpose it. I called the board of the open window that afternoon. "We're opening the Harlow House," I announced. "It's not a shelter. It's a transition manor. We're going to house 4 seniors at a time, people like Martha who have lost their homes to exploitation. They'll live here, rent-free, for 6 months while Arthur's team clawbacks their assets. We're going to fill this house with the one thing Javier and Sophie couldn't stand: people who refuse to be invisible." The renovation took a month. We put the rose bushes back. We painted the shutters a vibrant, defiant blue. We installed the best security system money could buy, and we filled the kitchen with heavy oak tables and chairs that were built to last a century. On the day of the ribbon cutting, I stood on the porch. Martha was there, looking 20 years younger in a bright yellow sweater. Emma was there, holding a plate of cookies she had baked herself. I looked at the Harlow House sign hanging by the door. I realized that Javier had sold this house to buy a lie, but I had bought it back to build a truth. The house wasn't a commodity anymore. It was a fortress. As I watched the first resident carry her suitcase through the front door, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The reclamation of Berwyn wasn't about the real estate. It was about proving that you can't truly sell a home. You can only lose your way back to it. I didn't stay the night. I handed the master keys to the live-in coordinator and walked down the steps. I was going back to my apartment with the big windows. The circle was closed. Berwyn was finally at peace. The state correctional facility was located 2 hours outside the city, a sprawling complex of razor wire and sun-bleached concrete that sat like a scar on the flat Illinois prairie. I drove the distance in silence, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound. I had ignored his letters for months. I had ignored the collect calls. But Arthur told me that Javier's final appeal had been denied. He was settled into his 5-year sentence, and I knew that if I didn't see him now, the basement ghost would haunt me forever. The air inside the visitors' center smelled of floor wax and industrial detergent. I went through the metal detectors, my navy dress rustling in the sterile quiet. The guard led me to a small booth with a thick plexiglass partition. When Javier was led in, I almost didn't recognize him. The logistics legend was gone. He was thin, his face gaunt, his hair shorn close to the scalp. He sat down and picked up the black plastic receiver. I did the same. "You came," he whispered. His voice was scratchy, stripped of the polished confidence he once used to sell me on the Barrington suite. "I came because I needed to see where the lies ended, Javier," I said. He looked down at his hands, which were resting on the cold metal ledge. "I deserve this. I know that now. Every time the lights go out in my cell at night, I think about the vent. I think about how cold you must have been." "The cold wasn't the worst part, Javier," I said, my voice steady. "The worst part was the silence, knowing you were 10 feet above my head, laughing and drinking wine, while you waited for me to disappear." "Sophie's gone, Mom. She took the last of the offshore accounts I didn't tell Arthur about. She's in Europe now. She doesn't even accept my calls." He let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I traded my mother for a woman who wouldn't even send me a book to read." I looked at him, my only son. I looked for the spark of the boy who used to help me in the garden, but all I saw was the wreckage of a man who had tried to buy a soul and found out they aren't for sale. "I didn't come here to forgive you, Javier," I said. "I'm not there yet. Maybe I'll never be. But I came here to tell you that I've turned our old house in Berwyn into a home for people you tried to destroy. I'm using your investment to save the parents of people just like you." Javier's eyes welled with tears. They rolled down his cheeks, landing on his orange jumpsuit. "I'm glad. At least the house is doing something good." "Emma is doing well," I added. "She's with Sarah. She's learning that a home is built with kindness, not marble." Does she hate me?" "She's 10, Javier. She doesn't have the energy for hate. She just has a lot of questions that you'll have to answer in 4.5 years. The guard tapped on the door. Time was up. I stood up, but I didn't hang up the receiver yet. I pressed my hand against the plexiglass. Javier mirrored the gesture, his palm lining up with mine, separated by 2 inches of bulletproof plastic. "Don't spend your time in here feeling sorry for yourself," I said. "Spend it figuring out who you are without a bank account, because when you get out, that's all you'll have left." I hung up the phone. I didn't look back as the heavy steel door clicked shut behind me. As I walked out into the afternoon sun, the prairie wind was blowing, smelling of wild grass and freedom. I felt a strange light sensation in my chest. The prison visit wasn't for Javier. It was for me. I had looked into the face of the man who had tried to erase me, and I realized he no longer had any power over my story. I was the author now, and the next chapter was going to be filled with light. By the spring of 2026, the open window was no longer just a foundation. It had become a legislative force. I sat in a high-backed chair in a hearing room in Springfield, watching as the governor signed the Harlow Act into law. It was a simple piece of legislation with teeth. It mandated automatic criminal stays on property transfers involving seniors if a wellness certificate wasn't signed by a neutral third party. It was the safety net I had dreamed of while sitting on that twin mattress in the dark. Arthur was there, his hair a bit whiter, but his smile sharper than ever. He leaned over and squeezed my hand as the cameras flashed. "You did it, Bob," he whispered. "You made it impossible for them to hide the ghosts anymore." But the true legacy wasn't in the law books. It was in the living, breathing reality of the people we had touched. I spent my 71st birthday at the Harlow House in Berwyn. We didn't have a catering crew or a brand strategist. We had a long table set up in the backyard, under the shade of the oak tree Frank and I had planted 40 years ago. Martha was there, now a full-time mentor for our newest residents. She was laughing, showing a man named Elias how to prune the rose bushes. "The trick is to cut back the dead weight, Elias," she said, her voice firm and joyful. "You have to make room for the new growth to see the sun." I watched them, and I realized that I had created a tribe. We were the unbreakables. We were the ones who had been pushed into corners and found our way back to the center of the room. Emma sat next to me, her sketchbook open. She was 15 now, with a quiet intelligence that reminded me so much of Frank. She wasn't drawing stick figures anymore. She was sketching the house, capturing the way the blue shutters caught the light. "Grandma?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Do you think Dad will ever see this place?" "He has photos," I said. "I send them to him once a month. He's working in the prison library now. He's teaching other inmates how to read financial statements so they don't get cheated on the outside. He calls it logistics for the little guy." "Maybe he's finding his way back," she said softly. "Maybe," I replied, "but even if he isn't, we are here, and that is enough." As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, I felt a profound sense of completion. My bank account was no longer the measure of my worth. My brand wasn't something curated on a screen. My legacy was the sound of Martha's laughter, the scratch of Emma's pencil, and the fact that 4 people were sleeping tonight in rooms with windows that opened to the breeze. I walked inside the house and went to the kitchen. I picked up the teapot with the blue flowers. It was chipped on the spout, a reminder of the day Javier had knocked it over in his rush to leave, but it still poured perfectly. I poured a cup of tea and stood by the window, looking out at the neighborhood. The lights were coming on in the houses down the street. For so long, I had been afraid of the dark, but now I saw that the dark was just the space between the lights, and I was the one holding the match. I opened my blue ledger. It was nearly full. I didn't write about the law or the money. I wrote about the air. May 11th. The air in Berwyn is sweet today. The windows are open. The ghosts have all gone home. The year was 2028. 2 years had passed since the Harlow Act became the gold standard for elder protection, and the world had moved on to new scandals, new influencers, and new hashtags. But in the quiet corner of my apartment, and in the bustling hallways of the Harlow house, the work continued. I was 73 now. My steps were a little slower, and the navy dress hung a bit looser on my frame, but my eyes remained as sharp as the day I first recorded Javier's betrayal. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind where the sky turns a bruised purple and orange, a color I used to watch from the tiny cracked window of the storage room. Now, I watched it from my balcony, the scent of lavender heavy in the air. A knock came at my door. I didn't need to check the peephole. I knew the rhythm of that knock. I opened the door to find Javier standing there. He had been released 3 days ago. He wasn't wearing an orange jumpsuit, but he wasn't wearing cashmere either. He was in a simple flannel shirt and jeans. He looked like a man who had spent a long time in small rooms, thinking about the space he had occupied in the world. "Mom," he said. "Javier?" I stepped aside, and he walked into the light. He didn't look at the furniture or the view. He looked at the photo of Frank on the mantel. "I went to Berwyn today," he said, his voice thick. "I didn't go inside. I stood on the sidewalk. I saw the blue shutters. I saw the sign." "It's a good house, Javier," I said, sitting in my armchair. "It's doing what a house is supposed to do. It's protecting people." "I have the money, Mom," he said, pulling a small, weathered envelope from his pocket. "It's not $300,000. It's $4,200. It's what I earned working in the prison library. I want it to go to the foundation, to the open window." I looked at the envelope. In the grand scheme of the millions the foundation now handled, it was a pittance, but in the economy of a soul, it was everything. "Put it on the table, Javier," I said. He did, his hand trembling slightly. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw my son. Not the logistics legend, not the man who wanted a marble kitchen, but the boy who used to be afraid of the dark. Can I sit with you for a minute?" he asked. "Just until the sun goes down?" I nodded. We sat on the balcony in 2 chairs, side by side. We didn't talk about the storage room. We didn't talk about Sophie, who was reportedly living in a small village in France, still trying to sell wellness retreats to unsuspecting tourists. We just watched the light fade over the city. "The windows really are big here, Mom," he whispered. "They are," I said. "You can see everything from here. You can see the truth coming from a mile away." As the last sliver of the sun disappeared behind the skyline, I felt a deep, resonant peace. The story that had begun in a cold, dark basement was ending in the warmth of a sunset. I had been a ghost, a victim, a witness, and a hero. But as I sat there with my son, I realized I was finally something even better. I was a mother who had held her ground. I was a woman who had refused to be erased. I reached over and took Javier's hand. It was warm. "The oatmeal is in the kitchen, Javier," I said, a small, wry smile touching my lips. "And this time it's hot. Go have a bowl." He laughed, a real shaky laugh, and stood up. As he walked into the kitchen, the light from the hallway spilled out onto the balcony, illuminating the blue ledger resting on the side table. I picked up the pen and turned to the very last page. I didn't write a long entry. I just wrote 2 words in a firm, clear hand. Light stayed. I closed the book, leaned back, and watched the stars come out over a world that was no longer hiding its ghosts. The ink on the Harlow Act was barely dry. It was a Tuesday evening in late May, and the air in Chicago was finally beginning to hold the warmth of the coming summer. I sat on my balcony, the blue ledger resting on my lap. The trial was over, the law was signed, and the Harlow house in Berwyn was already full of life. I didn't need to jump years into the future to see the victory. I could feel it in the steady rhythm of my own heart. A quiet knock came at my door. It wasn't a bailiff or a lawyer this time. It was Arthur. He walked in carrying 2 cups of tea and a small folded newspaper. "It's front-page news, Barbara," he said, handing me a cup. "They're calling it the daylight reform. You've officially made it a crime to keep a secret in a cellar." "I didn't do it alone, Arthur," I said, looking at the city skyline. "I just opened the window. The world did the rest." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. My son Javier was currently beginning his first week of his 5-year sentence. He was far away, in a room much smaller than the one he had forced me into, but for the first time I didn't feel the weight of his shadow. I felt the lightness of his absence. Emma came out onto the balcony, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She sat at my feet, her presence a living reminder that the cycle of greed had been broken. She wasn't 15. She was still my 10-year-old Emma, the girl who had saved me with a pink envelope. "Grandma?" she asked, looking up at the stars beginning to blink over the lake. "Do you think the people in the Harlow house are happy tonight?" "I think they're safe, Emma," I said, stroking her hair. "And for people like us, safety is the first step toward happiness." I picked up my pen. This was the final page of the ledger I had started in the dark. I didn't write about the money we had recovered or the mansion we had lost. I wrote about the current moment, May 2026, the moment I finally stopped being a ghost and started being the author of my own life. I wrote 2 words in a firm, clear hand. Light stayed. I closed the book. The story was no longer a record of survival. It was a map for anyone else still lost in the dark. I stood up, walked inside, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back at the door to make sure it was locked. I was home, and the windows were wide open. If this story shocked you, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more powerful emotional stories about betrayal, justice, and survival. And remember, sometimes the people who smile at you at dinner are the same people building your prison in silence. Comment below. What would you have done in Barbara's place?